You've been waiting for the feeling to come back, and you know exactly what I mean. That fire you felt after the worship set. That bone-deep clarity you had the morning you first surrendered your life to God. That specific Tuesday, maybe 6 months ago, maybe 6 years ago, when you woke up before your alarm, cracked open your Bible, and felt like the ground beneath you was finally solid. And then it evaporated. So you made a deal with yourself. When it comes back, I'll get back on track. When work settles, when the debt shrinks, when the kids need less, when life finally exhales enough for me to become the person God actually called me to be. But life never exhaled. The feeling never fully returned. And now you're caught in this cycle. Every Monday, every New Year, every time a sermon cracks something open in your chest, you restart. And by Wednesday, you're right back where you started. Here's what nobody told you. That feeling was never supposed to be your engine. It was supposed to be a signal. And the fact that the signal went quiet doesn't mean God went silent. It means it's time to stop running on emotion and start constructing on structure. Today we're going to examine a man who had every legitimate reason to shut down completely. No freedom, no advocate, no timeline, no guarantee. And instead built something so durable, so systematically sound, that it reshaped the trajectory of an entire civilization. Welcome to Sharp Faith, where we don't water anything down. Look, before we get into this, I want to say something. I know some of you clicked on this video because you're exhausted. Not physically, spiritually. You've tried. You've started over more times than you can count. And there's a part of you that's almost afraid to hope that this time will be different. I hear that. Stay with me. Because what I'm about to show you from the text is going to reframe everything. Point 1. The myth of the motivated Christian. Here's the trap most believers fall into. They wait to feel prepared before they move. And I understand the appeal of that. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like patience. It sounds like you're not getting ahead of God. So you wait. You petition heaven for the feeling. You ask for the open door. You ask for the sign. But here's what the Bible actually teaches. Paul writes in Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters." Now stop right there. Most people absorb that verse like it's a motivational poster. Give it everything. But consider this carefully. Who was Paul addressing when he wrote Colossians? He was writing to a congregation that included enslaved human beings who possessed zero legal rights, zero choice over their circumstances, and zero emotional reason to perform with excellence. And here's where the original language detonates this passage wide open. The word Paul chose for work in the Greek is ergazomai. And that word does not mean try harder. It does not mean push through when the inspiration hits. Ergazomai carries the idea of ongoing, structured, committed engagement. Think of a master carpenter who appears at his workbench every single morning, not because a bolt of creative energy struck him overnight, but because showing up to the bench is simply what he does. The action precedes the feeling, always. Read that again. Paul is not describing a surge of spiritual adrenaline. He is describing an operating system. Some people will say, and I get it, but doesn't God want our hearts to be in it? Doesn't He care about more than just going through the motions? Absolutely. And here's what the text actually says to that. Paul isn't asking these people to fake enthusiasm. He's pointing them to a source that transcends emotion entirely. Working as unto the Lord means your anchor is not how you feel about the task. Your anchor is who you're doing it for. That's not going through the motions. That's the deepest form of faithfulness available to a human being. The believer who waits for the fire to act will be permanently stalled. The believer who builds a framework so that action happens regardless of the fire, that person is operating inside the design God described through Paul 2,000 years ago. And there's a cross-reference worth locking in here. Galatians chapter 6, verse 9 says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Notice Paul says, if we do not give up, not if we stay motivated. The condition for the harvest is persistence, not emotional consistency, not feelings as fuel, but faithfulness as foundation. Here's your action step. Tonight, not this weekend, not after you finish the dishes, tonight, open your Notes app or grab something to write on and complete this sentence. Even when I feel absolutely nothing, I will still do blank at blank time tomorrow. One action, one specific time. That sentence is the first brick of your system. Do not skip this. And honestly, I'll be real with you for a second. I used to believe that if my quiet time didn't feel electric, I was doing it wrong. I thought the absence of feeling meant the absence of God. And that belief kept me stuck in a performance cycle for years, only showing up when I felt like I had something to bring. It wasn't until I started studying how Joseph actually operated in prison that something shifted for me. Because Joseph had nothing to bring emotionally. And yet, point 2, Joseph didn't survive prison. He operated it. Let's go deeper into a story most people think they already understand. Joseph is 17 years old when his brothers strip him of the ornate robe his father gave him, throw him into a pit, and sell him to a caravan of Ishmaelite traders heading to Egypt. He arrives in a foreign country with no network, no language advantage, and no legal standing. He works his way into a position of trust in the household of Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's senior officials, only to be falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown into prison. No trial, no appeal, no projected release date. Just a cell in a foreign country where nobody knows his name matters. Now here's the reading most people do with this passage. They see Joseph as a passive man enduring a season of sovereign suffering, a man who kept his head down, maintained his integrity, and eventually received his divine reward. And that reading produces a particular kind of Christian, one who is quietly waiting to be rescued while doing the bare minimum to stay afloat. But that is not what the text describes, not even close. Genesis chapter 39, verse 22 says, "So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there." All that was done there. Joseph wasn't white-knuckling his way through a dark season. He was running logistics. He was managing personnel. He was solving operational problems inside a facility he never should have been in. He was building. And then verse 23 delivers the interpretive key to the entire narrative. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Now, and this is where the Hebrew changes everything. The word translated success in that verse is tzalach, and on the surface the translation is serviceable, prosperity, success. But the root of tzalach doesn't describe a static condition. It describes kinetic forward movement. The original meaning is to rush forward, to break through, to push through with force, the way a river breaches a dam after years of pressure. Think about that. Tzalach is not a destination on a map. It's a current running through every decision you make. What the text is communicating is not that God gave Joseph a reward at the finish line. It's that God's tzalach, his surging, breakthrough presence, was coursing through each disciplined action Joseph took in that prison, day after day, in the dark, without an audience. Let that sink in. The miracle wasn't the palace at the end. The miracle was the presence of God embedded in every ordinary act of faithful construction while Joseph was still wearing chains. Here's a misunderstanding worth correcting directly. Some teachers read this passage and conclude that Joseph's promotion was entirely supernatural, that God just flipped a switch and elevated him. And while God's sovereignty is absolute, the text tells a more layered story. When Joseph stands before Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 41 and interprets the dream, he doesn't stop there. He immediately proposes a comprehensive 7-year economic strategy: grain collection infrastructure, regional distribution networks, a governance framework to manage it all. He didn't draft that proposal in the throne room. He spent 13 years developing and refining those exact skills in Potiphar's house and in the prison. The palace didn't create the capacity. The prison did. Imagine you're sitting across from someone, a mentor, someone you deeply respect, and they ask you this question. If you were placed in the worst professional environment of your life, with no credit, no recognition, and no timeline for promotion, would you still bring excellence to your work every single day? What's your honest answer? Not a waiting room, but a construction site. Here's your action step. Take your most constrained current circumstance, the job that feels beneath you, the season that feels like a detour, the situation that feels like a cell, and write down one specific competency or character quality this situation is actively building in you. Not what you're losing, what you're being forged into. Then write one sentence describing what it would look like to bring full operational excellence to that circumstance this week. Point 3. Systems are sacred. Feelings are seasonal. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 5 says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty." Straightforward enough at first read. Work carefully, win. Rush, lose. But the Hebrew word behind diligent is sharutz. And sharutz doesn't simply mean hard-working. The root verb means to be incised, to be engraved, to be sharpened through repeated friction, the way a surgeon's scalpel is honed against a whetstone until the edge becomes so precise it can do what a dull blade never could. Pause. Think about what that image actually means. A surgical blade doesn't become precise in one dramatic session. It becomes precise through repeated, deliberate contact with something that refines it. Every pass of the whetstone removes a little more of what doesn't belong. And over months and years, the sharpness stops being something the blade achieves. It becomes something the blade is. That's charutz. Not someone who summons heroic effort on the good days. Someone who has repeated a pattern of behavior so consistently and for so long that the behavior has been engraved into their identity. The discipline no longer costs them significant willpower, because the discipline has become their default operating mode. This is exactly the kind of thing we unpack every week on Sharp Faith. This next one is uncomfortable, even for me, because what I'm about to say indicts a system that many of us were raised in. The idea that spiritual highs are the goal. That the mark of a healthy faith is a continuous emotional connection to God. And when that emotion flatlines, something must be spiritually wrong with you. That framing has quietly paralyzed an entire generation of believers, and it needs to be confronted. Here's the problem with most Christians and their relationship to spiritual discipline. We're deploying willpower, a resource that research consistently shows depletes throughout the day, under stress, under decision fatigue, to perform actions that should have been automated months or years ago. You should not be deciding every morning whether you're going to spend time with God. That decision should have been made the moment you surrendered your life. What's left each morning is not the choice, it's the execution. Think of it like a professional athlete. LeBron James doesn't wake up on game day and decide whether he feels like working out. The workout is already on the calendar. The shoes are already by the door. The routine fires automatically because it's been engineered into his environment and his schedule so thoroughly that not doing it would actually feel strange. Not willpower borrowed from your emotions, but architecture built into your days. And here's the cross-reference that locks this in. James chapter 1 verse 4 says, "Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Maturity, spiritual completeness, is the product of perseverance finishing its work, not inspiration finishing its work. Perseverance. That word describes a sustained, structured response to pressure over time. Here's your action step. Starting tomorrow morning, attach one spiritual practice to something you already do every day without any cognitive effort. Something as reflexive as breathing. If you make coffee, the moment that machine starts running, you open one page of Scripture and read one verse out loud. That's the whole assignment. You're not constructing a 2-hour devotional life overnight. You're carving a groove, a trigger point, the beginning of something that, given enough repetition, becomes charutz, permanently engraved into the architecture of who you are. But wait, before we get to point 4, I need you to sit with something for just a second. Because I know some of you have a vision, a calling, something God whispered to you that you've almost stopped talking about because it's been so long and nothing has moved. Maybe you've told yourself that vision was just you being delusional, or worse, that you misheard God. Stay right there. What I'm about to say is specifically for you. Point 4. The dream was never the reward. It was the blueprint. Genesis chapter 37, verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. God gave Joseph a vision at 17. He saw himself elevated to a position where even his own family would bow before him. And then, as if in deliberate, almost cruel sequence, every subsequent event seemed to drive him further from that picture. Betrayal, slavery, false accusation, prison, forgotten by the very person he helped. 2 additional years of silence after that. Now, most people file this away as a story about patience being rewarded. And while patience is certainly present in the narrative, there's a dimension of this passage most teachers walk right past. The word for dream in the Hebrew is shalom, and the root verb, shalom, carries a meaning that the English translation barely touches. Shalom doesn't just mean to dream in the passive night. It means to be made strong, to be restored to robust health, to be fortified. In the cultural and theological framework of ancient Israel, a God-given vision was understood not simply as a preview of a destination. It was a transfer of strengthening energy for the journey toward that destination. Here's the historical context that matters enormously. Joseph received this dream during one of the most relationally devastating periods imaginable. He was the favored son of a dysfunctional family, surrounded by brothers whose resentment had already curdled into something dangerous. God gave him the dream, not because the path would be easy, but because the path would be brutal, and he would need a reservoir of divine fortitude to draw from across the years of hardship between the promise and its fulfillment. A common misreading of Joseph's story is that the vision was the payoff, that God gave it to him as a prize for something. But that inverts the actual function of the dream. The vision was not a trophy. The vision was training equipment. I remember talking to a man once, a guy in his late 30s, who told me he had been carrying a calling to start a ministry for over a decade. He'd had the vision clearly. He'd even written it down, had the name, the logo, everything. But nothing had opened. And he said to me, "I think maybe I just made it up." And I asked him one question. What has the waiting built in you that wasn't there 10 years ago? He was quiet for a long time. And then he started listing things. Patience, empathy for people who are stuck, financial discipline he'd been forced to develop, a theological depth that only comes from years of private study with no platform. He hadn't been waiting for a decade. He'd been being built for a decade. He just didn't have the framework to see it that way. Here's your action step. Write down the vision or calling you believe God placed in you, even if it embarrasses you to look at it, even if it feels naive after everything that's happened. Underneath it, draw 3 columns. Label them skills, character, and capacity. Fill in what you would genuinely need in each column to carry that vision without collapsing under the weight of it. That list is your current curriculum. The season you're in right now is producing exactly what those columns require. Point 5. God doesn't bless moods, He blesses movements. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. The word translated handiwork in the Greek is poema. You recognize the root. It's the ancestor of the English word poem. And a poem is the opposite of an accident. Every word is selected. Every line is placed in deliberate relationship to the lines around it. Every pause, every rhythm, every turn of phrase, intentional. Paul is saying that your life, your specific calling, your particular design, the unique combination of your history and your wiring and your experiences, is a poema, a crafted composition with divine intentionality woven into every verse. But here's the piece of this passage that most people sit on without fully receiving what it's actually saying. The verse states that God prepared the good works in advance, past tense, already done, before you were born, before every mistake you've catalogued against yourself, before the season you're currently in. Not waiting to be created, already prepared and waiting to be walked into. The works exist. They're already in the room. The only variable is whether you are moving in their direction. And you cannot navigate toward a prepared future by remaining stationary, waiting for a mood to shift. You move toward it by constructing a pattern of daily motion that consistently orients you in the right direction, regardless of how you feel on any given morning. Here's your action step. Before you close your eyes tonight, before the phone, before anything else, spend 5 minutes with this single question. What is one prepared work I believe God has called me toward? And what did I actually do today that moved me in that direction? If the honest answer is nothing, receive that as data, not condemnation. Then decide right now what you will do tomorrow. One movement, executed regardless of how you feel when you wake up. Point 6. Your system is your testimony. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. The word transformed in the Greek is metamorphomai. Metamorphosis. Yes, we know the word. But here's what almost every casual reading of this passage misses entirely, and it's grammatically significant. In the original Greek, this verb is written in the present passive imperative form, which means it is not describing a singular event that occurred in the past. It is a command for an ongoing, continuous process. The most accurate translation is not be transformed as a once-and-done transaction. It's keep being transformed. Remain in the posture of ongoing transformation. Allow the process to continue. Here's a widespread misunderstanding this directly corrects. The church, with the best of intentions, has often packaged transformation as a moment. You have an encounter at an altar call. You receive prayer, something breaks, you walk out changed. And absolutely, God can and does work that way. But the grammatical structure of this verse reveals that the normative, intended pattern of spiritual transformation is not a single seismic event. It is a cumulative, layered, daily renovation of the mind. Your brain is being shaped right now by what you consume repeatedly, by what you allow to occupy the foreground of your attention hour after hour, by what you rehearse in your internal monologue. Neuroscience has confirmed in the past 50 years what Paul wrote in the 1st century. Repeated input creates structural changes in the brain. New pathways form. Old pathways erode. What you practice consistently, you become. That is not self-help theory. That is the mechanism God built into human cognition, and Paul identified it as the pathway of transformation before anyone had a word for neuroplasticity. Yeah, I said it. Your sanctification and your neurology are operating on the same principle. Because the God who designed the brain also wrote the letter, not conformed by drift, but transformed by deliberate, daily construction. Here's your action step. This week, starting today, identify one consistent input that is actively shaping your mind in the wrong direction. A media source, a conversation you keep returning to, a thought pattern you rehearse when things go quiet. Write it down. Then identify one replacement, one specific source of input that pulls your thinking toward who God is calling you to be. Not a complete overhaul of your consumption habits. One swap this week. My system outlasts my feelings, and every system starts with the decision about what you allow through the gate of your mind. Point 7. The moment nobody saw was the real miracle. Genesis chapter 39, verses 20 and 21. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. Sit with that for a second. Joseph is in prison. He did not deserve to be there. He resisted every temptation. He served with excellence. He protected his integrity at significant personal cost. And he still ended up in a cell. And the most theologically weighty statement in this entire chapter is not a promise of future deliverance. It's not a preview of the palace. It's a declaration about the present moment. The Lord was with him. In the Hebrew, Yahi YHWH, et Yosef. And the grammatical construction of this phrase deserves attention it rarely receives. This is not a casual, general statement of divine awareness. The structure emphasizes continuous, active, proximate presence. Not God monitoring the situation from a distance. Not God filing Joseph's case for future review. God with Joseph, actively, immediately, without interruption, in the worst chapter of his life. And honestly, that verse wrecked me the first time I really sat with it, because I had been reading Joseph's story for years as a story about endurance being rewarded. And then I saw that verse through the Hebrew and realized the reward wasn't the palace. The reward was the presence. The palace was just what the presence produced. The most corrosive spiritual lie you can absorb is this: that God's silence is the same as God's absence. That when prayer feels like speaking into a wall, when the circumstances haven't shifted in months, when the breakthrough you've been believing for still hasn't materialized, God has retreated. He's disappointed. He's waiting for a better version of you to show up before he re-engages. Not withdrawn in the silence, but most actively constructing within it. Joseph received no angelic visitation inside that prison. No prophetic word of encouragement that the text records. No dramatic confirmation that the dream was still alive. What he received was the Lord with him, invisibly, consistently, working through every day he chose to build rather than collapse into the bitterness he had every right to feel. The years in that cell were not the intermission before the real story began. The years in that cell were where the most critical construction happened. The character that sustained Joseph through 4 decades of leadership in the most powerful empire on earth the wisdom, the administrative discipline, the emotional stability. None of that was handed to him in the throne room. It was built, beam by beam, in a prison where nobody was watching and nothing was guaranteed. Where are you building right now that nobody can observe? What are you doing in the private hours, in the early mornings, in the late evenings, in the chapters that haven't made it into anyone's highlight reel yet? Here's what nobody told you. God's power is not most concentrated in your moments of public breakthrough. It is most actively present in your private construction. In the mornings you showed up when you had nothing to bring, in the discipline that didn't feel spiritual at all, in the system that kept running after your feelings shut down. If you've been curious about what faithfulness in a prolonged season of silence actually produces, what it builds in a person over years of unseen obedience, that's a thread worth pulling. The story of Joseph doesn't end in the prison, and neither does yours. Here's your action step. Before this video ends, right now, in this moment, do one thing from the system you're going to build. One action. Not because you feel motivated by what you just heard. Not because this script landed the right way. Do it because your system operates independently of your feelings, and doing it right now is an act of faith that declares, I believe God is present and active even when I cannot detect Him. That one action is a theological statement made with your body. Make it today. Hear me carefully. Every hard truth I laid out in this video, every challenge, every moment I held a mirror up and didn't look away, I did not do any of that to add to whatever weight you're already carrying. I know that some of what landed in this video hit something tender. I know that some of it exposed patterns you've been quietly ashamed of for longer than you want to admit. That was intentional, but not for condemnation. Never for condemnation. Because here's the difference between shame and conviction. Shame drives you underground. It says you are the problem. You are the defect. You are the exception to God's faithfulness. Conviction does the opposite. Conviction hands you a blueprint and says, here's the door, here's the key, here's the first step through. You are not behind. You are not disqualified. You are not the one person God has decided to leave in the hallway while everyone else gets into the room. You are in your prison chapter, and the question before you is not when God is going to move you out of it. The question is what you are going to build while you're inside it. This was not a lecture. This was a construction plan. And blueprints aren't for people who have it figured out. They're for people who are ready to break ground, even before they feel ready. Especially before they feel ready. God was with Joseph in the prison. Let that sink in. He is with you, right now, in this. So here's what I want you to do, right now. Not after the weekend, not tomorrow morning. Right now, take out your phone, open your Notes app, write down one system, one habit, one action you will take tomorrow morning, regardless of how you feel when you open your eyes. Attach it to something you already do. Make it small enough that skipping it would almost feel ridiculous. Then come down to the comments and type, "My system outlasts my feelings." That is not a catchphrase. That is a declaration. You are telling God and telling yourself, out loud, in writing, where it counts, that you are finished waiting for the emotion to move you first. You are building something that will still be standing when the emotion is long gone. And if this video opened something real in you, if it named something you've been circling for months, send it to someone who's stuck in their own prison chapter. Someone who keeps restarting. Someone who's been waiting for the feeling to come back. This blueprint might be exactly the framework they've been looking for. Subscribe to Sharp Faith so you never miss a blueprint drop. Stay sharp.